Welcome to this special episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman, as you can see on the screen, she is a US-based national security and human rights lawyer, as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in the world, according to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you so much. I'm, as always, very glad to be here.
Thank you, Irina. Thank you. And it's been a wonderful show now. This is the seventh episode, and this particular series is doing very well. A lot of people are liking it. We have got hundreds and thousands of views on on this particular series. So we will continue to serve people as long as we can. So let's talk. There were several big topics again. Last fortnight we talked about COP28. Now that is over. Now that we are talking, let's talk about the final outcomes of COP28. Help us understand how should we look at it. Finally, there was an agreement, to transition from fossil fuels. That agreement came after a lot of discussion. What language that should be? Help us understand. You are the expert.
Well, there was a lot of drama surrounding that particular major outcome. The final agreement was a compromise solution because a number of oil-producing countries threatened to boycott the push to transition from fossil fuels. The big push was from a number of countries who wanted a mandatory binding process that would basically force everyone to essentially ban fossil fuels. The final agreement does not ban them, but creates a process towards increasingly moving towards more sustainable outcomes as COP28 defines us. I think one of the biggest practical implications for that is the growing support for nuclear energy. I think that's very important because nuclear energy is something that everyone can agree on is clean, abundant in many parts of the world, easy to produce, and would not necessarily place an unfair burden on developing countries, unlike many of the other green transition processes that are forcing many countries to choose between economic and environmental concerns. And ironically, one of the biggest trends is that those countries like Germany that shut down their nuclear facilities, nuclear civilian plants, are now forced to open up coal plants, which are far dirtier than even oil or gas reliant technologies. And gas is actually a very clean form of energy. It's much better than coal. There's been an effort. The US is now one of the leading and at times a top lead producer of oil and natural gas. But the another issue with these forms of energies is that transporting them, as we have seen, can place a geopolitical risk. We are seeing that supplies of fossil fuels are heavily affected by geopolitical realities. The war in Ukraine disrupted a lot of energy related processes. It created opportunities for some countries, but it also created risks for the fossil fuel import dependent countries. So these nuclear focused developments, seeing that so many countries are coming together to support that form of energy, is actually a positive development, even for the skeptics of the most extreme climate change policies. And there's been a controversy about that too. Another major aspect, besides this transition agreement, which, by the way, I think ultimately will take far longer than what is agreed on paper. That's just the economic reality. Transitioning from anything to anything always takes time, probably more time than anticipated, and who knows what will happen between now and whatever the theoretical deadlines are for these things. But in the meantime, another major development is agriculture and food security that are being and the farming that are being discussed and taken seriously, and the impact of climate change and changing circumstances on these issues, and supporting developing countries, and also developing more environmentally friendly processes for getting all of this done. So here I am of mixed minds, because the concept of expanding this reality to agriculture, I think, is very positive. And I think it is true that in many countries, in hot climates, it's a real issue. Water is a real issue. Environmental impact is a real issue. Pollution and just changing patterns of climate over time, it's just something happens regardless of what causes it. But at the same time, we must be cautioned by what has happened in the United States, in Netherlands, and other countries, major food producing countries, where ESG standards imposed on farmers, reporting standards, and for adherence to various standards related to climate change related concerns, emissions, and so forth, created ex- extensive burdens, limited land production in a way that's not healthy. In Netherlands, it caused a political backlash. In the U.S., there's been also a heavy pushback from the farmers, and some of these ESG standards are being kind of revised. They're just not really sustainable. So this has to be balanced. I think one of the outcomes was talking about rebalancing meat production, but actually what they should be looking at instead, in my opinion, is the practices, water conservation practices around agriculture in general, because I think that's actually far more of a general concern. You can talk about limiting or not limiting meat, but there are various ways to feed animals, whereas crops all need water, 100% of them. So and that's actually is probably the major factor in all this, in terms of farming. But all in all, there's been a lot of breakthroughs in that sense, and of course I think a lot of it was very much geared towards coming up with investment opportunities, not to be cynical, but for companies, for innovation technologies to showcase their possibilities. And I think a lot of deals have been made, and I think the political trends and outcomes are less important than these immediate opportunities in technical development. I think the AI and innovation in AI, when it comes to technology, has been also a major point of discussion, and it's going to be a big and probably very positive factor in improving the efficiency of technologies, which hopefully will make a lot of these practices less labor intensive, more efficient, and helpful to everyone engaging them. So next year's COP is going to be in Azerbaijan, which is ironically another major oil and gas producing country that is at the same time also working with EU on developing a lot of green technologies, uh, green green energy projects. So that's going to be very interesting as well. How all these countries that are actually the most who are doing extremely well at times of energy crisis, and who are now leading the exports of energy to Europe and other places, first UAE, now Azerbaijan, are also at the same time investing heavily in the green transition without sacrificing their main current source of income. So I think they have been very much able to hold their own in under these circumstances, and I think that's not as surprising as it should be, given the realities of the fact that whatever the future outcomes today, everyone still needs to make money.
Right, right, Irina. In terms of Azerbaijan hosting COP29, it is the host for next year's climate meeting. That is a growing perception, that the COPs have been partly captured by fossil fuel interests. This time it was Dubai, and next time it is Azerbaijan. They have been, they are very much into these fossil fuels. They have said they have got gas reserves. That's the promise. How do you look at? There was a lot of wrangling around who will host next year. Finally, Armenia giving in and Azerbaijan getting in with the support of Russia and all. How do you look at this part? How do you look at this perception? And is it a good perception? How should we look at it from outside?
I think the process of these green projects and climate change is indispensable. With the participation of fossil fuels industries is indispensable. I think it's naive to pretend that there can be any transition without their participation. First, because even a very gradual process needs to involve more efficient and cleaner forms of delivery, while whatever divestment we want to see is happening. And second, most of these so-called green technologies are reliant on oil and gas to for production purposes. The only alternative to that is either coal or nuclear energy. Nobody really wants coal. People use it because if they have no other options, but nobody, there's not one country that is going to say that there's their preferred option if they had to. It's only because if they don't have any other option, so it's the cheapest, and it's simply not a priority for them. But nuclear energy is also something that has not something that yet is yet to be developed to its full potential. So we are not there yet. There is growing investment into it. It's a great sign, but we're not at the point where it's completely can be completely self-sustaining for all forms of industry. So oil and gas are necessary to fuel electrification, to fuel the development of military technologies. Anything you look at, you cannot do it without the use of these industries. And of course, plastic is made on petroleum based products. There's been some effort to get rid of plastic, but that's also I think a little bit far off from reality at this point in time. It's only natural that these industries are not only necessary but are big investors into these firms. They know that they can make money from being from their products being used in all these different industries, and they're looking for new ways to distribute their range. And of course, Azerbaijan's participation is doubly symbolic because it is seen as a sign of regional integration in South Caucasus. Finally, conflicts and tensions are being put behind these countries, and they're moving towards a more a solid economic and energy cooperation, which is something a lot of countries want to see. And it's ironic that Russia and the US agree on that one point, along with the EU. That might be the only point they agree on, actually.
Right, right. From COP28 and COP29, let's move on to India. The FBI director, he was here. Christopher Wray, he was here. Met a lot of security and in Indian security and services personnel here, and a lot of other things that we may not know. How do you look at this visit? Normally, there are visits, but FBI director, especially in the backdrop of this, indictment of a Indian there, Panun assassination plot, all these things. How do you look at it all from that perspective?
So obviously there was a lot to discuss, both in terms of dealing with the legal and political aspects of this particular incident, but also, as I suspected and as I was hoping to happen, with the broader framework for future cooperation. And a lot was reported on the fact that there was counterterrorism cooperation, security cooperation discussed. There was the discussion of a framework for dealing with this Palestinian situation. I think it's major, though, that uh, FBI is only one entity in the US. It is not a decision maker. It's a tactical security entity. It can only move towards best practices sharing with India, which would be a very positive sign. But in terms of the politics of this situation, it's not sufficient. It's only a first step, a necessary and inevitable step, even. But I think broader public perception needs to be shifted through information, education, engagement, to gain broader support in the West and to gain the sort of public understanding that will help smooth over the edges from this situation. At the same time, there's something else was going on besides this particular incident, which has not been reported as widely as this scandalous um, story, which is the fact that around the anniversary of the 2008 Mumbai attacks, we have seen a takedown of a number of ISIS-linked cells from in several different parts of the country, approximately 19 or so locations, including major cities. And while I'm extremely happy that this a major disaster and attacks on various locations have been prevented, at the same time it's a sobering sign that neither ISIS nor terrorism and extremist ideologies in general have been finished. And this offers yet another ground for cooperation with the United States, because the rise of these organizations is back, just because they're state actors at war with each other in different parts of the world, and proxy wars and so forth going on, doesn't mean that the international jihadist organizations have gone anywhere. On the contrary, they're capitalizing on crisis and on the distraction and on the shift in strategies to return to the field. And this could have been a major disaster, and these people, if not they're fully caught, and this time their handlers and their supporters and founders, uh, if they're not identified and through the international cooperation taken down, we can see these networks proliferate elsewhere, maybe in India today, some other part of Asia tomorrow, back to Europe the day after, the United States the day after that. And I am hoping that the visit by the FBI chief and his team touched on these issues, and I am hoping that this announced major success in counterterrorism was positively impacted by these discussions, because these guys don't tend to stay in one place. This ideology is transnational, transborder. They don't care about borders. They're looking to build a caliphate everywhere they can and to reclaim whatever lands they think they're entitled to. And it's the fact that it's not a bigger story is only due to the fact that we have two major wars going on elsewhere. Otherwise, this should have been front page news elsewhere. It shows a very significant planning effort, very significant recruitment effort, and it shows to me that that despite all the counterterrorism, extremism investment by various countries around the world, whoever is investing into it in the other side, in terms of funding, in terms of intelligence, in terms of logistics, they haven't gone anywhere. They haven't been deterred, and this ideology has not been successfully finished. So we have to understand, why is there such a huge return, such a brazen return at this time? It's symbolic, of course, in terms of the anniversary and trying to send a message, but there is got to be more to the story. There seems to be that it's also timed with the fact that other terrorist organizations are now reactivating, feeling emboldened, and that sends a message even to unrelated or seemingly unrelated global causes, to that they have more freedom to act, and that's very concerning.
Absolutely, absolutely. Staying with India, how do you see this security breach of India's parliament? And there must be there was a lot of news that's continued to talk about that. There's continued talk around this. How did you see it from that part of the world?
Could you just repeat the first part? I missed the
Yeah,
portion.
yeah,
Yeah.
the security breach at India's
Oh, so yes,
parliament.
yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes. Yeah. I think this is part of the pattern of activity going on, because, as we mentioned last time, there's also been a wave of cyber attacks around the world, but there's been also a rise in incidents. Some of them are linked to specific parties. Otherwise, others have not been identified. In Greece, there's been a bomb planted near a police station, supposedly by far left protesters, but these far left protesters may have ties to foreign regimes hostile to the current Greek government. Similarly, the security breach in parliament, yes, of course, security procedures and protocols need to be reviewed, but the question is, why now? And once again, we have the context of the anniversary. We have this ISIS operation going on. We have continuous, you know, the Khalistanis may have been actually emboldened by these last developments, and other unidentified actors just seeing that there is you know, a rise in security incidents are trying to take advantage of the chaos and make it even more difficult to keep up with the situation. So I think we can actually expect more attempts to distract, more attempts to create a chaotic security environment from different directions, and we need to be very vigilant.
Right, right. Let's now move on to the Middle East. What's happening at Gaza? And from Gaza, things are happening now in Denmark, Germany. They thwarted Hamas attacks in Europe. So, what do these operations, globalized operations by Hamas, means? What is happening between US and Israel? There seem to be a lot of different voices coming. Is US now moving away from Israel? How does it all look like? There are lots of visits happening. I want to understand, what is happening at that end in terms of Hamas, in terms of globalized operation, in terms of the relationship between US and Israel.
Well, it's been a complicated few weeks, but Hamas is actually carrying out exactly what it promised to do, and it can be trusted to disclose. Once it starts talking publicly, you can be sure that what they say is exactly what they mean. When they are deceiving, when they are quiet, they may be lying, they may be pretending, but once they start discussing their strategy, they are very clear about their goals and agenda, and they are following exactly what they laid out in the very beginning of the war, which was that they had plans with Iran's backing to attack locations in other countries. And European countries where they started targeting Israelis were those countries. They are going global. They have been global for a while. Their financing certainly has been global. Um, we have seen articles coming out on various investment projects in various parts of the world, in Europe, in Turkey, and now we're seeing that their sales are coming to fruition. Germany has been rounding up some of the Hamas operatives, but other parts of the world have not been as aggressive, and even Germany can't necessarily identify every single location and every single cell. So there's been a cross-border cooperation in trying to stage these attacks. For now, they're still sticking to Israeli targets. And but first of all, in a terrorist attack, even non-Israelis can be harmed. And second, it's only a matter of time when before they start targeting everyone else. As we have seen during the war, they deliberately took foreign workers hostage. They took Arab Israelis hostage. They have killed Arab Israelis and other foreigners. So there is no ethnic or religious discrimination. There's only a particular strategy, and that strategy is only likely to expand. As far as the US and Israel are concerned, yes, there are differences. The biggest difference is about the future. Who will govern Gaza? Personally, I think it's still too early to count those chickens, and actually it's too early to count on a complete success of this operation. I don't think that the entire military echelon from Hamas is going to be eliminated anytime soon. They may take out a few leaders. Not all of the hostages have been released or rescued yet, and all of these tunnels that need to be destroyed are very difficult to destroy. Now there may be a shift in strategy in trying to break them up into modes, because blowing up all of Gaza is just not feasible. It's creating a lot of outrage, and there's been several incidents of friendly fire and accidents involving civilians, Christians in Gaza, and so forth, that just created a lot of very bad optics. U.S. has also been trying to get Israel to have a plan for a transition to a different strategy in the future. The fact is, on the one hand, US is putting some of this pressure too early. On the other hand, Israel doesn't seem to have an actual transition plan to anything different. They have a general objection. I'm not entirely sure they know how to quite get to that point. So I think it is wise to start thinking what to do next. But I also agree with John Kirby, who said that it's not wise to put timelines and timestamps on any phase of the operation because it will simply give Hamas an unfair leverage. It will tell them exactly what to expect and how to restructure their aims. Now, Israel is proposing a new ceasefire for lasting over a week if Hamas releases over 3 dozen hostages unharmed. Hamas has previously rejected the possibility of such exchanges very recently. I don't know how they will react to this latest development that's been brokered by Qatar, but they have also at various points asked for a ceasefire on terms that Israel could not accept. So they clearly do want and need a pause. It is said that Israel is getting closer to Yahya Sinwar. His brother was observed riding through one of the biggest tunnels uncovered so far. So if Yahya Sinwar is liquidated or captured, that would be a huge uh, PR victory for Israel. It would be also a huge military breakthrough. But until that point, they still have to deal with the reality that Hamas has been thoroughly entrenched in Gaza, and Hamas also has links outside Gaza. And we are seeing that US, European countries are only starting to sanction a lot of these Hamas players. It's unclear where the sanctions were in the past, given that Hamas is on the terrorist list in all these countries. But I guess they thought that Hamas was not an immediate grave danger and did not feel like stirring the hornet's nest by aggressively and publicly going after these actors. Whatever the case may be, they're starting to do that now, and it will be a while before these sanctions really take effect on the financing. But the good news is Israel did eliminate one of the top Hamas financiers in Gaza, so that should send a message at least. There's also rumors that some of the Hamas leadership left Qatar and Turkey in an unknown direction after Israel's threats to assassinate them. That could be also be a minus because now that we don't know where they are, it will be harder to find and actually kill them. So I don't know whether that public announcement really was necessary. But I think at the end of the day, U.S. and Israel, despite whatever these differences in strategy, they are kind of stuck together. Whatever Netanyahu may say to the public and whatever U.S. may say in an election year to its very diverse constituents, the security situation is such that neither country can afford to divest from another. You have U.S. is relying on local Israeli contacts, intelligence contacts for Hamas intelligence. The U.S. has not been following that intelligence for the last 2 years, and U.S. does want Hamas eliminated. Without Israel, that's simply not going to be possible. We'll be back to where we started. The second cadre, the lieutenants, will rebuild. If they're left in power, they'll continue holding Palestinians hostage, and they'll simply take over Gaza again as soon as it becomes feasible if they're not fully destroyed or eliminated in some way, in such a way that they cannot easily restructure. It's still a huge job, and there still needs to be a lot of political pressure, financial pressure, simply cutting off weapons flow, financing, creating an international involvement in some way. All of these things are complicated and necessary, but at the end of the day, Israel and the US rely on each other for security reasons, and the situation in the Middle East is becoming far more complicated. We are seeing attacks by the Houthis on a daily basis. We are seeing a new coalition of ships trying to take down drones coming into the area and missiles and protecting commercial ships. We are seeing the impact it's having on the economy, and we're seeing many state visits to the region, in part to convince Israel to take measures to prevent escalation in reported victims in Gaza. But again, there's a lot of disagreement on whether those numbers are real and what should actually be done. And there's also other discussions concerning the Red Sea security. And now the Houthis are also directly threatening other countries, including the US, including Bahrain and other members of that coalition. So there's a lot to discuss, but there is a major difference inside the GCC, which is preventing a unified strategy. Saudi Arabia specifically asked the US to abstain from offensive attack on Houthi launch sites. They are afraid, they're concerned about direct attacks in their own territory, which have happened before, and in some cases, US failed to come to the rescue. UAE, on the other hand, has asked US to do exactly the opposite. They encouraged US to intervene, and US has also been in the past attacked and threatened by the Houthis. So this uneven strategy, unfortunately, is playing right into the hands of Iran, which is masterminding all of this disruption. It's causing some ships to take the long, scenic route around Cape, delaying delivery of oil and gas, or raising prices for the Far East countries like Japan and South Korea, heavily dependent on imports, and also causing a gas spike in Europe as well. So we are seeing that Houthis are actually achieving their goals, and they do not feel at all threatened. And all these visits so far have not resulted in any solution for all of us.
Right, Irina, right. In terms of, Middle East, US has been, it's almost like every subtle diplomacy at a high level. A lot of visits already made now. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, they are now traveling to Middle East, meeting not only the Middle East also, but also MBS and others. What does this all indicate? What should we understand? What is it that they can't convey on the phone that they have to visit there?
I think, first of all, I think they're hoping that Saudi Arabia will shift in the direction of some more active role in Gaza, um, because the current scenario is kind of a dead end. It's unclear how long the Israeli operation is going to proceed. It's likely going to be long term. There needs to be U.S. is looking for investors in Gaza for a rebuilding process. They want some solution for their IDPs and for the refugees, and they want additional sources of humanitarian aid. But just as importantly, there is a concern about the Houthi situation, about the regional security, possible escalation of Hezbollah, and what to do about it. And I think the US is not happy that the Saudis have been preventing US from taking more active measures, which US has threatened to do. And while, to be fair, in the past, US has been extremely reluctant to get involved in Yemen on that level and against Houthis, the fact that the targets have become so persistent and overwhelming, and the disruptions to the freedom of navigation has been so significant, I think it has shifted even the Pentagon thinking on this. But the Saudis remain an obstacle, and I think that meeting was at least partially geared towards getting some sort of agreement to that end. It remains to be seen what, if anything, has what red line has come out of it. So far, it's not clear if there has been any.
Right, right, Irina. Let's move on to another area, another war that's about Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine is trying to get as much help as possible, trying to get help from the EU and be part of it. Zelensky's visit to Washington and NDAA passage. What does that mean? How should we understand how was that visit? And in terms of now, when we are talking of Ukraine, European Union, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, he seems to be making a lot of news. At one point in time, he was of a different opinion. He goes out and then it is a different opinion. What should we understand? And now, Moldavia is also looking at being a part of. How does this all pan out in terms of Ukraine, in terms of, NATO membership, the EU membership? All these things help us understand. And also in terms of Hungary's prime minister, who is he? Obviously, he's Hungary's prime minister, but what exactly does he want to achieve in terms of all these different talks? But at the end, all I can say is making a lot of news.
Well, yeah, there's a lot going on. Zelensky's visit to the US was largely unsuccessful. He did the right thing by trying to engage the Republicans, and not, he's had a pretty positive message in many things. I think he should be talking a lot more about US self-interest in Ukraine and less about Reagan and democracy, because quite frankly, a lot of Republican institutions have moved past that. They're much more populist now, much more isolationist, and that sort of messaging does not speak to them. Unfortunately, that's the reality. But I think the main issue has been actually less Zelensky himself or whatever messaging from Ukraine, and more internal disagreements between Democrats and Republicans over the fact that Ukraine funding has been tied to the border security issues, and there's been no progress in resolving that. The White House finally offered major concessions regarding some of the implementation of these issues, but it's not clear exactly where the Republican red line is on this issue. Nobody is happy with the state of things, but they're not articulating clear, measurable goals that they want the White House achieve that could lead to a practical negotiation that could result in some sort of an agreement. They're just holding out for something, but I think I'm almost getting the sense they're more concerned with being seen as not giving in on Ukraine aid than actually resolving the border security issue, because I'm not seeing practical suggestions from them, and I'm somebody who is in full agreement that this is a very grave security threat that needs to be dealt with as soon as possible. The fact that they're not, in fact, dealing with it despite a lot of grandstanding is, for someone who is actually security oriented, is deeply disconcerting. When it comes to Ukraine has had to actually, there is a practical impact of the aid delays in that Ukraine has had to cut down on military operations. And lest the US and others forget, if Russia succeeds in its goals in Ukraine, it can and will likely expand its field of operations towards minor NATO members like Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. And it then it will, NATO will invoke the Article 5, and it will force US to bring in troops, and that can lead to American injuries, and that's which is exactly what everyone's been trying to avoid in the first place. So I think investing money wisely is much better than actually having to spend a lot more later when the problem has become a lot bigger. But so far we're seeing major disasters. The bills are likely not going to be implemented until 2024 because Congress is now going into recess. This means weeks of warfare, with Russia making progress in some areas and very slow progress on Ukraine's part in other areas. There's been success in taking down some of the Russian weapons, but Russia has been compensating far faster uh, than anyone has been willing to give it credit for its human losses, for its military losses. It has been circumventing sanctions. Some of the sanctions have not been enforced. Others are simply being being taken down by countries and entities, and it has a good chance to make a breakthrough by the time the spring arrives if Ukraine's drone warfare strategy does not succeed, and if US and others do not resolve the funding issues. Europe so far has been trying to compensate um, through both individual countries and EU as a whole, but this is where the Hungary issue comes in. Let's recall who Orban was. He was someone who pretended to be a classical liberal visionary future of Hungary, but he came from a far left background, and his party eventually shifted towards the right and eventually subsumed all of the conservative movements in Hungary, from centrist conservative classical liberal oriented movements. It became increasingly populist, and now if I had to compare Orban with anybody in the world, it would be Turkish President Erdogan, because they operate in the identical manner, using populist language to appeal to their constituencies, grandstanding about sovereignty, while also, in Turkey's case, violating sovereignty of others, and in Hungary's case, demanding huge financial boons and having a very weak economy, highly dependent on the rest of Europe, a very small popular base from which to draw on. So it can grandstand about sovereignty, but it's so dependent on the uh, financials from others that it's difficult to respect that position. If you want to be independent, then don't take money from your neighbors and while making demands from them. And Orban has revealed himself to not be particularly concerned about institutions, civil institutions. um I think I would not call him a dictator, though I think it's very important to make the distinction precisely because he has such a large popular support inside the country. He has managed to win over a lot of people. Many people are dissatisfied with the way he rules, with the way laws are being changed, and it's very fair argument, and I agree with that. I don't agree that he's doing so without any popular approval whatsoever. And that's important because if you I think calling someone a dictator when they actually have a broad popular base will likely backfire and only entrench these people and have them become martyrs for the cause without a need. And he's very close. This is somebody very close to Putin, who he is in as an entity that's basically laundering money from oligarchs and Russian institutions into the West, and is being basically a satellite intermediary for various Russian operations, funding of propaganda, information warfare, investment into pro-Russian education in, especially in conservative or transnational kind of isolationist circles. Some of them also come from the left as well. He also is making a political pact with Serbia, another Russian ally, as well as with Turkey, and increasingly trying to move into Turkic states. And it's very open. Hungary is very open about it, and they're trying to create this energy pact with certain countries, and also a political pact. And we should understand that they're moving strategically, that it's not random, and that they're exploiting certain political games being played within EU by trying to move in with some of the countries there and kind of um, make false analogies of supposed similarities between them about how all of them are being victimized by Westerners or isolated. And there is some truth to some of it because some of their allies have been picked on by various political parties, but that's not to say that Hungary itself is being picked on unfairly completely. They have been, as I said, using their position as a single veto country to pull exactly the sort of political stance Erdogan has been doing, holding up aid for Ukraine, despite the fact that every day that aid is held up, Russia grows stronger. It has more opportunities to entrench militarily, more opportunities to move politically deeper into EU, support more pro-Russian parties, and it has also been in try to block the European Ukrainian entry into the European Union. The talks that are only a starting point for a long, complicated process. In exchange for billions of dollars in the aid it supposedly doesn't need because it's so prosperous and successful. I mean, that's why I'm a little bit surprised, quite frankly, at the fact that so many conservatives in Europe and US are looking towards Hungary as an example to emulate, given the fact that it has to essentially extort concessions from EU. If you are a successful country, you should have enough of a diplomatic presence and relationships to not have to do that. Second, its agenda is anti-Western quite openly. Third, it's not actually successful. Its economy is significantly underdeveloped after all these cash infusions. It has a very small and dwindling population, which means its conservative family values are simply not working for whatever reason. And um no, and quite frankly, a lot of it is just bluster. A lot of it is bluster that is appealing in terms of messaging, but does not is not practically supported by action and by results. So it's not actually a conservative example to emulate. It is simply another Russian proxy that is playing the exact sort of talking points Russia has consistently played directly as well. And I think anyone should be willing to should be able to see through that. It's not an economic powerhouse that conservatives would like to emulate. It's not like Poland, that's in fact quickly growing. It's not religious. Most of its population is actually one of the least religious countries in Europe. So I'm not entirely sure why everyone is suddenly so swept with Orban and his rhetoric, but this is not the man who presented himself as a Reagan-esque leader, 20 years ago. This is a completely different person.
Right, right. So all these developments around Ukraine, how do you think Russia will look at it? Putin will look at it. Just a few hours back, he was speaking at a military brass, talk with top military brass, and he talked that about the conflict, and he said that they have seized the initiative on the battlefield, and now they are well positioned to achieve Moscow's goals. How do you look at? Do you think Russia is looking at all these developments around Ukraine?
I know a lot of people like to make fun of Putin because it's very tempting. They like to make fun of his huge table that looks ridiculous. Some people are even spending their time guessing whether he's actually dead or or alive. but
Right,
but quite frankly, the speech should be disconcerting to many simply because it's on target and because he astutely understood exactly how the West is polarized right now, how the West has entrapped itself into these games that came in large point from internal dissatisfaction and distrust in its own institutions, and in part was fueled by Russian propaganda, and is taking set to take advantage of that politically by funding and investing into parties that are rising to power. Slovakia is one example. Hungary is another. Serbia is the third. In Spain, we are seeing the same dynamic, and I could name a number of others. But and militarily, because the more Ukraine is denied aid, the more whatever advantage it has managed to gain due to its successful uh, 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 operations in the beginning of the war are being erased, and the time plays to Russia's advantage. The time that is spent with inaction plays to Russia's advantage, and they can replace people because they have a far bigger population than Ukraine, and Ukraine cannot replace their fighters that easily. They're scrambling to find people, and it creates a very an economy. Ukraine's economy continues to suffer. Yes, Russia's economy has also taken a big blow, but it has managed to recover somewhat. It continues doing deals around the world. It has expanded far beyond the West, and it's been laundering a lot of money in the Middle East. It's been robbing Africa of its gold through Wagner and now direct intelligence operations and various criminal enterprises. It has its ways of getting around the various inconveniences placed on it by Western sanctions and other limitations. It has support. It's not going anywhere without a very aggressive pushback, and we have seen that pushback has an impact. Once Ukraine gained more sophisticated weapons like ATACMS, they in HIMARS, they have been making a lot of progress. As soon as that flow stopped, so has the progress. So these weapons were making a major difference. They are the difference between victory and a protracted, entrenched conflict that is threatens the entire West and not just Ukraine.
right, right. And talking of Russia, that intelligence file, the Intel file, one file has gone, has suddenly disappeared. Make out that is it because more related to elections, coming up of new elections 2024, that this 2016 US election related to Donald Trump, that file has suddenly gone missing, and that was about intelligence on Russia about their role or not role in the US elections at that point in time. Where is the file? Where do you think is the file? Irina, you are very well connected. You should know where the file is.
Well, I wish I knew, because if I had known, it wouldn't have been missing by this point anymore. But I think it's very interesting that Mark Meadows' assistant claimed that he had the file, that she saw him have that file. Mark Meadows, of course, cut a deal with the authorities to testify against Trump. The question is if he had the file at any point in time and probably was acting on Trump's behalf, and either hid it somewhere or gave it to Trump or gave it to somebody else. Why and at what point would he disclose that information in exchange to for what? If, on the other hand, she was mistaken and he did not have that file, or or he had something that looked like that file, but somebody else uh, got it. That file remains a weapon that can be used as a form of extortion. It could be used to target the American assets in various countries related to Russia. It can be used to cover up um, infiltration into the US. It can be used in damaging ways. So the question is, if it was left in a safe to begin with, in a vault, were there no security cameras that would indicate when it was relieved? If there was interference and tampering with the camera, is there no evidence to who could have done it? A file just doesn't disappear on its own. Someone took it. If Meadows did it, why, after all this time, the intelligence hasn't been able to get that information from him as to what happened to it? If somebody else did it, only a few people had access to that area. Where how is it that no evidence has been found to where it could have gone other than Mark Meadows? To me, I feel like there's something more going on with that story, that some part of it is missing, or somebody may know something but is deliberately um preventing the investigation from reaching a successful conclusion. Maybe somebody inside from the investigating team is not being honest with us concerning the evidence that we see, because it seems to me that after over 2 years with a cooperating witness who has all the reason in the world to cooperate against Donald Trump right now, you would think that if he was in any way involved, they would have found something by now. The fact that the file has disappeared into thin air, nobody knows. I don't believe that. I think somebody knows very and deliberately covering up leads in this case.
Absolutely, absolutely. Russia is in a lot of news. The word intelligence is in a lot of news. And moving on from Russia-related intelligence in the U.S., Donald Trump. Now let's move on to Russian intelligence. There are reports that it's taking over Wagner operations in Africa. What is your take on this? On these reports, how should we look at it?
Well, Wagner was always supposed to be a tool of Russian foreign policy. These were less professional fighters. A lot of them were criminals and foreign recruits that were used to as a means of plausible deniability for the intelligence to begin with. With Prigozhin's removal from public view and presumed elimination, though nobody has ever confirmed that his outside Kremlin own reports that his body was actually found there. Whatever the case may be, he is presumed to no longer be leading these operations, and I think it was a natural transition to what Russia wanted to do in the first place, which is simply establish its presence formally in Africa and to make official claim to uh, its spheres of influence in those countries. However, I don't think the intelligence will do much better than Wagner, which only met with partial success. Yes, they are able to loot a lot. Yes, they're propping up friendly regimes. But US is now reestablishing relations with Niger. A number of
Right.
countries were not happy with Wagner role, and now the waves of terrorists that are essentially lining up against these regimes and against Wagner specifically. So I'm not entirely sure how long they will last, even in terms of simply preparation for this sort of security challenges? Can they really fight wars with all these jihadis when they're also stretched in Ukraine? It's yes, they can make progress there, but it's still a big burden. I don't. I actually think that they may end up shooting themselves in the foot by overreaching in areas that are very difficult to control under the best of circumstances.
Right, right. Talking of, US to restart relations with Niger, what does that mean for West Africa security? Recently, the Niger was in a lot of news, and now US is again looking to restart its talk. How should we look at it?
Well, I think US is hoping that it can have a positive impact by first preventing a huge internal war with other West African countries, and also preventing jihadis from establishing an even bigger foothold than they already have. That would be a mess, a huge refugee crisis. I think US understands that dealing with a pro-Russian junta is not exactly great, but if Niger is willing to tolerate these relations, there could be an opening if Wagner or the Russian intelligence or whatever Russian presence is there, if they fail. And if they will fail because they're inviting problems by the strategy that they have developed inside the country against the various groups there. So I think US is looking to try to shift back and to try to cooperate and maybe squeeze Russia out of there to the best of their abilities. I am not sure they will be successful in the short run. In the long run, I think that junta without support by the Russians will ultimately um, fall, and we are seeing that in Mali, the local regime is also already having problems between the losing support of some of the initial anti-French parties, and we are seeing that some of these support coalitions could collapse of their own free will, and we could see the re-establishment of previous governments or some versions of them in the near future. There could be changes. I think US is trying to position themselves to be ready to take advantage of them if there is a shift in a positive direction.
Right, right. Irina, a lot of politics happening all across the world, a lot of things happening with Russia, in about Russia, a lot of things happening also in the US about intelligence. And now politics has seems to have entered a lot on the US campuses. Anti-Semitism crisis. This is the new crisis. What should we understand about this all these talks happening around anti-Semitism around in US campuses? How should we look? Investigations are happening. How should we understand that?
There are several factors that I would name. First, the DEI curriculum, this sort of very woke diversity, equity, inclusion paradigms ultimately end up being anti Semitic just by their nature, and they're actually very similar to quota systems that were directly openly anti-Semitic imposed by universities back in the 1920s, 30s, 50s, and so forth. Uh, a lot of them openly exclude Jewish students. There's been lawsuits to try to revise all of that. I don't think it's revisable. I think the very concept of focusing on identity, race, and other biological factors as opposed to merit um, and the effort and the individual contributions, I think it's always going to backfire and victimize one group or another, and Jews are just simply the easiest scapegoats for various reasons. Second factor is the funding by foreign unfriendly regimes such as Qatar and Iran, who have been pouring money into outright anti-Semitic curricula and groups on campuses, and universities have been going along with that, and a lot of the students who are openly anti-Semitic and harassing are foreigners. Us, therefore they pay a lot of money up front in cash, and the universities don't want to get rid of them. That's how they enable some of this activity. The third factor is unfortunately social media. A lot of students simply don't know anything, and they learn most of the information about conflicts and about anything really from TikTok, and TikTok has been spreading outright pro-Hamas and anti-Semitic propaganda. Despite US efforts to get it to stop, the company claims to take measures, but it's China, and China has been openly anti-Semitic and pro-Hamas in its own propaganda outlets. So why should social media aimed at the West be any different? That's kind of the goal. It's the strategy. The fourth factor has been the long-standing radicalization of faculty, and that's been something growing for generations. Started under the Soviet Union. Of course, Soviet Union was also filled with anti-Semitic propaganda, which they brought in part to the Middle East. It influenced the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamist organizations, and of course, campus ideology, which has come back to haunt us after several generations of increasing cycle of brainwashing, elimination of alternative perspectives. Is people, students at top schools, when they go to Middle East studies class, they learn that somebody like Osama bin Laden is a freedom fighter, not a terrorist. When they go to learn about American politics, they learn that whether underground a terrorist group were actually wonderful educators, things of that nature. So how can we expect these students who learn similar things in schools, by the way, K through 12, then go on to universities with no critical skills, or intimidated into spouting out garbage just to get a good grade? So that's the situation, and these factors will not be easy to undo, because a whole generation of young people, future leaders, thinkers, journalists, analysts, they have already been brainwashing. They're already out of school. They're already out there seeking employment, and some law firms, some medical hospitals have withdrawn job offers to the worst of the lot that have been shown to have radical sentiments on the social media or in the press. But not everybody is that vocal about how they feel and what they think, and I think this will come back to bite us in 10-15 years, even less, as they enter higher office and jobs and so forth.
Right, right, Irina. The world is getting full of disagreements everywhere, either on the political battlefield or even in campuses. And this is not a good thing. Talking about, disagreements, but what about Taiwan? Why are they disagreeing? Can't agree on the future of submarine production. The elections are next month. Then whoever wins can decide, and will get that. But why there is so much of talk about submarine, especially during elections? And how do we see that? How should we? Why can't the elections just happen and everyone then decides on the next move?
Well, security and concerns about China's aggressions obviously play into a lot of what the candidates would be pushing for. I think it's natural for a pro-security candidate to promise the development over some major um, defense mechanism that will make the country less dependent on foreign aid. However, there are alternative points of view from other candidates which view such discussions as provocative to China and inviting aggression from China, which claimed that any attempt to um, scale up any sort of defensive mechanisms could be viewed as an aggressive maneuver against China. Finally, and this is the middle perspective. And the third perspective is that Taiwan should simply be moving to negotiate some sort of a agreement with China, and there is, let's not forget, China is heavily invested into Taiwan. It's done a lot of business there. It has been until recently heavily dependent on chip semiconductor production in Taiwan. So they have a fair amount of influence in politics as well. China has been meddling in Taiwan election process, and I think some of this rhetoric, some of this unnecessary disagreement about what to anyone else would seem like a rather obvious next step, comes from that camp, to try to create fear inside the population that if they do start even discuss a production of new submarines, China could actually invite an attack. I think that's the kind of thing that that China wants to the Taiwanese voters to worry about.
Right, right. agreement or disagreement, meetings can always help. What happened at the meeting between Venezuela and Guyana? Again, it is about oil. What do we look at there? Is it going to be a better future between these two countries? The better, or this dispute will get solved, or is it the oil is going to continue to be slippery for them?
Well, here's the thing. The territory that Venezuela is claiming, it's not just a small slip of land with a lot of oil on it, unlike, other countries where that's the case. This is two-thirds of Guyana's territory, and Guyana is a very small country. So they're basically threatening to annex the entire country, and they have not moved away from their legal claims. They have only mutually committed to abstain from violence. Now, Venezuela is concerned about growing US presence and commitment, but on the other hand, it is also believes that US cannot indefinitely maintain that presence, especially if that presence is ultimately needed somewhere else. So they are testing the waters to see how far they can push the envelope at this moment. And they have seen that there are overflights, but then overflights cannot solve all problems. If there's a ground invasion, how far is US willing to go? Are they going to conduct airstrikes? Are they going to send ground troops? How much are they willing to help? I think we in over the next few weeks, if not sooner, we will see how Venezuela interprets US movement, and if US withdraws after some period, they may strike then. They may violate this agreement because they need the oil. They owe billions to China and Russia and to Europe as well. And the country is completely corrupt. It's ruled less by Maduro and more by Cubans, and Cuba is also bankrupt. So they need the money. They are deeply in debt, and they are also looking to subsidize the networks of intelligence operatives all over Latin America, despite having no funding for food and basic necessities and facing one of the largest refugee crises in the world and a brain drain. So this is why we find them looking at completely desperate measures such as takeover of their neighbors as a solution to their own financial problems.
Right. All these things need solution, but amidst all these things, the one concrete result that has come is the elections in Egypt. Uh, uh, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, he has swept back to a third term. How should we look at this? How should the world look at this?
Well, that's not altogether surprising, to put it mildly, but at the same time, we can expect Egypt to stay on course in trying to be helpful in resolving the Israel-Hamas crisis, and they have been a very strong diplomatic presence, and they have been trying to play a much more active role and a much more consistent and positive role than Qatar in this case. Um, and unlike Qatar, they do not have ulterior motives of dealing with Hamas. Hamas actually presents a security problem to Egyptians as well. I think there's a great deal for um, diplomatic cooperation. I think that the financial crisis in Egypt requires a lot more attention because foreign parties have been trying to use this situation to gain hold there. The Israel Hamas war has not helped on the popular level at all, and I think the combination of these factors, this populist pressure from Islamists and this financial crisis, can lead to a wave of unrest that can result in very very dire situation in Egypt. And I think this is the time for US to put away all the scandals, all the human rights grievances by various groups and focus on the big picture. The big picture is we cannot afford another Morsi type presence in Egypt. This is not something anyone can afford among all the other security issues. So we just need to do what we have to do to resolve those problems, help Egypt resolve those problems, and ensure stability inside the country that's right next door to Israel and that has over 100 million people.
Absolutely. This was the last of the topic for today. And as the world continues to do good things or not so good things politically or in terms of anything, we will continue to bring your perspective, every fortnight to the viewers and who will get the right kind of perspective to the things happening all around this world. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it as always.